Welcome to today's episode of the President's Diary podcast. For over 2 years, since October 2023 attacks by Hamas militants on Israel and Israel's retaliatory invasion of Gaza, Gaza has dominated global headlines with images of destruction, loss, and human suffering. The year 2025 brought in renewed hope with the announcement of the Gaza peace plan by President Trump, which was signed and went into effect on October 9 and endorsed by the United Nations Security Council on November 17 that same year. But as the bombs fall silent, a harder question emerges. What's next? Is Gaza entering a post-war future or another pause in an endless cycle of collapse and rebuilding? Today's conversation is not just about what Gaza has endured. We already know that story. It's about choices, systems, and courage. About whether Gaza will once again be rebuilt to survive or finally reimagined to live. My guest today, Dr. Iyad Abumoghli, brings a rare global perspective on sustainability, post-conflict recovery, and rebuilding societies under stress. Together, we ask, what does a future for Gaza truly require? I am your host, Destiny Afu. Dr. Iyad, welcome to the episode today.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Now, let's begin with a global picture. Let's look at Gaza as it is today. How will you describe where Gaza stands today, not just as a conflict zone, but as a broken system? And is Gaza in a post-war phase or merely a pause between cycles of violence?
Well, Destiny, Gaza today is not simply a battlefield. It is the collapse of an entire human system, a system that should protect life. Hospitals, schools, water networks, food supply chains, governance, and justice. This system has been systematically dismantled. What we are witnessing is not only destruction of infrastructure, but destruction of dignity, and in many ways, destruction of the minimum conditions required for life. So Gaza is not a conflict zone in the traditional sense of it. It is a space where the rules of war, the rules of humanity, and the rules of international law have been tested and too often ignored. So Gaza today stands as the most painful symbol of how normalized dehumanization has become. And this is where the ethical question becomes unavoidable. How can the world watch the destruction of an entire society and still speak in neutral language? This is a moral responsibility on the international community, not only to provide aid, but to defend the very concept of human dignity. When children are killed, when families are erased, when the civilians are displaced repeatedly, the issue is not simply security. It is whether the world still believes that Palestinians' lives have the same value as others. The double standard is painfully visible in other conflicts. International law is invoked immediately and strongly. In Gaza, it becomes negotiable, delayed, or selectively applied. So to your second question, I do not believe we are in a post-war phase. We are in a pause between cycles because the root cause has not been addressed. This is a dangerous illusion that once bombs stop, stability begins. But Gaza has been living under siege, occupation, and repeated assaults for many, many years. When people are denied freedom, denied sovereignty, denied security, and denied the right to rebuild without external control, then any ceasefire becomes temporary. So yes, it is a pause because the architecture of violence remains intact. Occupation, blockades, impunity, and the denial of Palestinian rights to land and self-determination. And unless this architecture is dismantled, Gaza will remain trapped between destruction and incomplete construction.
Now, the world has often responded to Gaza for years with emergency aid. No stable political systems, no stable security systems. Why has this approach, in your opinion, failed to change Gaza's long-term reality? And at what point does humanitarian assistance become a substitute for political and human development?
Well, the humanitarian approach has failed because it has been used as a management tool, not as a solution. Aid has been treated as if it can compensate for the absence of justice. But humanitarian assistance cannot substitute for political rights. For years, Gaza has been kept alive through emergency response, food tents, medicine, and short-term reconstruction. But without ending the siege and occupation, this becomes a cruel cycle. Destroy, donate, rebuild partially, and destroyed again. It is not recovery. It is containment. There is a moral and legal point here. International humanitarian aid is not charity. It is an obligation. But when it becomes the main response, it risks turning into a way for the international community to feel engaged while avoiding the harder issue, accountability and political resolution. At some point, humanitarian assistance becomes an instrument of denial of the political reality that Gaza is not poor. Gaza is impoverished by design. Gaza is not fragile. Gaza is targeted. And we should say clearly, this is not accidental failure. This is a predictable outcome of a system where Palestinians are denied rights while the world finances its survival. It is ethically unacceptable to reduce an entire people to permanent recipients of aid while denying them sovereignty. The double standard here is glaring. No society is expected to live under blockade and repeated assault while being told that aid is the answer. Aid can treat symptoms, but it cannot remove the cage. This world must also confront the fact that economic investment alone is not the solution. Economic packages, donor conferences, and reconstruction pledges, all of this is meaningless without a holistic political framework. Because what is being destroyed is not only buildings, but the very foundation of normal life, freedom of movement, security, rule of law, and dignity. And without those, investment becomes temporary, and Gaza becomes a laboratory of dependence. And the world must ask itself, why is the responsibility always placed on donors and humanitarian agencies, but not on those responsible for the violations of international law? This is why the importance of the ICC and ICJ processes cannot be overstated. They represent an attempt to restore a basic principle that law applies equally.
Let's give perspective to the recent peace plan that was announced by President Trump. I think it should be in its second phase now. But as we all know, the bombs haven't really fallen silent as we had hoped. I think just 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday, there were still reports of bombardments by Israel in Gaza, killing a lot of civilians. Now, let's give perspective to this peace plan. Do you think this has been meant to rebuild Gaza the way it was, or to fundamentally reimagine Gaza? And is the dream of a resilient, peaceful Gaza realistic, and how can this be achieved?
Well, again, Gaza should not be rebuilt to return to the status quo, because the status quo was not peace. The status quo was siege, dependency, controlled borders, controlled energy, controlled water, and controlled movement. A life where development was structurally blocked. So yes, Gaza must be rebuilt, but more importantly, Gaza must be reimagined as a free, dignified, and self-determined society. Rebuilding without freedom would simply reconstruct a large prison. A resilient Gaza is realistic, however, but only if the international community is honest about what resilience requires. In my opinion, it requires first ending the siege and occupation, guaranteeing freedom of movement for people and goods, restoring Palestinian political rights, including self-determination, accountability, so violence is not repeated without consequences, and regional and international guarantees based on law, not power. But I want to add, reimagining Gaza also requires rejecting the idea that Palestinians must accept economic prosperity as a substitute for political rights. This is not peace. This is coercion. It is morally wrong to offer investment while denying sovereignty. And it is politically naive to think that people will surrender their identity, land, and dignity for projects and money. This is why many so-called peace initiatives fail. They are designed to manage Palestinians, not to liberate them. We must also reject the development models that are disguised forms of colonization, new types of colonization, including attempts to impose externally designed peace deals that trade rights for economics. We saw this clearly, as you mentioned, in Trump peace plan. It is not peace, by the way. It is rebranding colonization under the language of prosperity. Peace cannot be bought. Peace must be built on rights. And there is another dimension. Gaza is also part of a broader geopolitical contest. Powerful actors compete for influence, or to influence corridors, ports, gas, and strategic control. When natural resources and regional dominance become the hidden drivers, Palestinian rights become inconvenient. This is why we must insist on a rights-based framework to prevent Gaza from becoming a bargaining chip in the race for power.
Amazing. I love that contribution. Now let's get to what post-conflict recovery for Gaza would look like. In your opinion, what matters more in post-conflict recovery? Is it the physical reconstruction of Gaza or its strategic institutions? What does local ownership actually mean for Gaza, and how can it be protected from external dominance? And who must be on the table for Gaza's recovery to succeed beyond paper plans?
Well, Disney, I believe both infrastructure and institutions matter. Mm-hmm. But if I had to choose what is more decisive, it is institutions. Because institutions protect people when crises return. So roads can be rebuilt, but trust, legitimacy, rule of law, and social cohesion are harder to restore. Local ownership must mean something very specific. Palestinian deciding their own future, not external powers designing it for them. Local leadership means Palestinians set priorities, not donors. Palestinian institutions manage reconstruction, not external trusteeships or companies. No imposed governance arrangements that deny sovereignty. No reconstruction conditioned on political submission. No security first approach that becomes a permanent control mechanism. So we have to be careful. The language of stability is often used to justify external dominance. But stability without rights becomes another form of control. And ethically, the world must ask, why are Palestinians constantly treated as subjects of plans rather than authors of these plans? The double standard again appears here. Other nations emerging from conflict are supported to restore sovereignty. Palestinians are often offered administration without sovereignty. That is not recovery. It is containment with a different name. So as for who must be at the table, of course, Palestinians from Gaza, and the West Bank, including civil society, women leaders, youth representatives, professionals, legitimate Palestinian institutions and governance structure, UN agencies and multilateral development institutions must be there, regional actors, but with respect for Palestinian sovereignty, and importantly, legal accountability mechanisms, because without justice, institutions remain fragile. And we must add a key point. Institutions cannot survive under permanent threat. You cannot build governance while people are exposed to repeated destruction. Governance must be linked to protection. Gaza needs not only planners and donors, but guarantees of safety, dignity, and legal protection under international law. And it needs compensation and repatriation as part of justice, because rebuilding without remedying harm is incomplete.
Amazing. Now, you talked of the United Nations to be as one of the key players to be involved in Gaza's post-conflict recovery. But we all know that during this conflict, the United Nations was absolutely silent, except the fact of providing humanitarian aid. Why do you think that was the case? And how do you think the United Nations can play a greater role in Gaza's post-conflict recovery?
Well, we must distinguish between the different departments and organizations and structures within the United Nations system. We have programs and assistant departments and missions, while at the same time we have the Security Council, right? And if you have noticed, UNRWA, WHO, OCHA, the Secretary General, the General Assembly, all were for the dignity for the Palestinian people and for non-restricted aid getting into Gaza. However, the other elephant in the field, which is the Security Council, that is, mostly dominated by the veto holding powers, is the bottleneck there. So any decision that is not according to the liking or the political games of the 5 permanent powers, and in most of the cases it was one powerful nation that used vetoes time and again to obstruct the United Nations systems from working in Gaza and for the Palestinian people. So we cannot blame the United Nations systems. The United Nations needs the approval of member states to be able to operate and provide. And you heard so many of the leaders and heads of organizations, they always say we have tens of thousands of aid just packed outside the borders of Gaza. Let us in and we will make sure every Gazan citizen has access to food, water, and shelter. But of course, it's the obstruction and of course the complicity of the surrounding countries of preventing that aid into entering into Gaza.
Gaza has one of the youngest populations in the world. We all were witness to how children, youth were daily massacred by the bombardments of Israel. How do you rebuild hope for a generation that was raised amid war? And from your global experience working at the United Nations, what investments in people matter more than roads and buildings?
Well, listen, to me, hope is not a slogan. Hope is a political outcome. Young people in Gaza have lived through repeated wars, siege, trauma, loss, and uncertainty for so long. If the world wants to rebuild Gaza, it must rebuild the social contract, the belief that life has meaning and the future is possible. From global experience, the most transformative investments are few. First, education, not only access to, but quality and relevance. Second, mental health and psychosocial support at large scale. Third, decent jobs and dignified livelihoods. Fourth, digital infrastructure and global connectivity. Civic space and participation. Youth must be actors, not victims. And finally, scholarships and mobility. Movement is freedom and movement is opportunity. But let's be honest here. You cannot tell young people to dream while they are trapped. Without freedom of movement and political rights, investments become limited. So the first investment in youth is not money. It is ending structural captivity. Ethically, this is one of the most urgent issues. A world that allows a generation to grow up under siege and bombardment is producing not only trauma, but deep injustice. And injustice breeds despair. The double standard is again obvious. Young people elsewhere are told they are the future. Gaza's youth are treated as a humanitarian burden that is morally indefensible. So the goal must be to restore dignity and protection. Youth need safety, not only services. They need freedom, not only funding. They need self-determination, not only training. And yes, they deserve prosperity, but prosperity built on rights, on open horizons, on access to the world, and on a future where their lives are not repeatedly shattered.
Now, the story of Gaza relates to the wider story of other countries and other regions in conflict. For example, Sudan, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo. I want us to use the example of Gaza. What does Gaza reveal about the failures of the international system in managing protracted conflicts? Is the world just reacting to Gaza or avoiding accountability?
Well, simply, Gaza reveals the deepest contradiction of our international system. It claims to be built on law, but often operates on power. The international system has failed mainly in three ways: failure of prevention, repeated warnings ignored about Gaza and what's happening there and the sovereignty and the rights and so on; failure of protection, civilians not protected, humanitarian workers even targeted; and third, failure of accountability. Impunity becomes normalized, and this is dangerous. Gaza has shown the limits of multilateralism when powerful states choose selective applications of international law. It has shown how the Security Council, as I mentioned a bit before, can be paralyzed, how humanitarian principles can be undermined, and how human rights can be treated as optional. But there is also something else. Gaza has revealed the rise of the peoples of the world as moral actors. We are witnessing unprecedented global public mobilization against genocide, occupation, and apartheid-like realities. This matters, by the way. And this is precisely where ethics and double standard intersect. The world order cannot survive on hypocrisy. If the international system tolerates the killing of civilians and destruction of entire communities in one place, while condemning it strongly elsewhere, it sends a message that international law is not universal, it is political. And this is a recipe for global instability. So yes, governments may avoid accountability, but societies are demanding it. That is again why the ICC and ICJ matter. They represent a struggle to return to a world where law restrains power. And Gaza also reveals something about geopolitics, that some conflicts are prolonged intentionally because powerful actors benefit from the imbalance through strategic dominance, arms markets, control of resources, and shaping the region. This is why the path forward must be multilateral, lawful, and right-based, not driven by dominance and resource competition.
Amazing. According to you, what bold but realistic ideas are missing from the current discussion about Gaza's future? And what uncomfortable decisions must be made if this cycle must be broken?
Listen, the missing ingredient in all of this is courage, the moral courage and the political courage. So some bold but realistic ideas might include, of course, a reconstruction framework explicitly grounded in international law and Palestinian self-determination, not charity, a binding mechanism to end the blockade and guarantee freedom of movement, international protection for civilians consistent with UN Charter principles, a serious accountability track, not symbolic statements here and there, recognition that peace requires ending occupation, not managing it, and regional security built on cooperation, not domination. There are also some uncomfortable decisions that need to be made. First, powerful states must stop shielding violations with vetoes and exceptionalism. There must be consequences for grave breaches of international law. The international community must abandon the illusion that economic peace can replace political rights. And Arab states must move from fragmented positions to coordinated positions and strategic unity, because this unity invites external domination. And I would add, courage also means confronting the ideology of supremacy and domination that drives repeated aggression. There is a pattern of expansionism and regional intimidation here, not only in Palestine, but towards surrounding countries, because the goal is to be the under or uncontested power of the region. The ambition is enabled when Arab countries are divided and when international actors reward aggression with impunity. And finally, the lesson I would take from all of this: when a people's rights are denied for decades, instability becomes permanent. And when occupation is normalized, violence becomes cyclical. And when dehumanization is tolerated, the world loses its moral foundation. History, by the way, will not ask how many statements were issued. It will ask whether the world defended human dignity equally or only when convenient. It will ask whether multilateralism served justice or served power. And it will ask whether Gaza became the moment humanity restored the primacy of law, dignity, and equal rights, or the moment it surrendered them. This is the main question here.
Amazing. So much to digest on that, just so much. Now, this is a personal question to you. If you have to look at Gaza 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, personally, what are your hopes of what Gaza could become? Integrating it into the wider Palestinian story. This is a very personal question.
It is personal and it's very difficult to answer. And I would answer it in two parts. The first part, if I dream of a Gaza in 5 years, I would say occupation has ended, people has restored dignity, people has prospects for a better future. Neighboring countries and friendly countries have come to support Gaza, rebuild and reimagine, and to provide the necessary human-based approach system assistance. So this is what I dream. But what I hope is that in the coming few months, reality comes to a check. where countries gather again, and I hope they come to the senses that supremacy is no longer a valid argument or an objective or a target of a country. Because if it is not Gaza today, it might be your country tomorrow. If Gaza submits today, your country will submit tomorrow. And we are talking about a global system now that gives the powers to the most powerful. And if you are complicit in this, you do not wait for your turn only, but you are encouraging this to be big and more powerful. So I hope the international community will come to its senses. We are seeing some indicators when the very nature of Europe, the very sovereignty of Europe is being threatened. Europe has waken up and they are unifying against that threat. Now, I don't know how the things will turn around, but I hope a peaceful resolution, not submitting to the powerful greeds, but to the international senses in cooperating rather than competing.
Amazing. Just as a conclusion, I think Gaza's future would not be decided only by agreements or aid packages or rebuilding plans. I also think it will be decided when the world shows courage to move beyond managing suffering to restoring dignity. And what's next for Gaza is not just about a Palestinian question or a Middle Eastern question. It's a global test for leadership, imagination, and responsibility. I think history is going to remember this moment as a moment where humanity failed to rise to its responsibility for moral leadership, but also it's going to be a test to where nations find themselves in the future. Thank you, Dr. Iyad, for talking to me this evening. I wish you a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you very much, Destiny. Lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.